Because of the diverse way that horror films affect their viewers, they're one of the most dynamic and intriguing of genres. They have the ability to thrill their viewers, entertain them, provoke them to think about things, and of course, scare them. The story of the film genre begins way before the motion picture was ever actually created. At first, stories were just told through ancient folklore and mythology from person to person. People would talk about ghosts, demons, monsters, etc., and they would tell these stories that would have deep psychological effects on each other, causing them to become really scared. Eventually, in 1918, a woman by the name of Mary Shelley took these horror ideas and put them on paper, making the first Gothic novel called Frankenstein, which we've all heard of. For a little under a century, it kind of just went like this. There were only literature and folklore, and there was nothing on film. That was until 1896, when Georges Méliès made the La Manor du Diable, which is just a translation to The Haunted Mansion. And it was a relatively simple 3-minute film that talked about ghosts, bats, and devils. But it was transformative because it was the first ever film horror movie that really set the stage for everything else to come. After that, we got a bunch of new horror literature pieces adapted into movies, with some being Frankenstein, Dracula, and The Mummy. Now, there's a lot more to the story of the horror film, and I'll get back into that later, but I think it's important to talk about some of the main characteristics of horror films. And the main one is, of course, being scary. Filmmakers often employ a lot of different strategies to do so, with some being jump scares, suspenseful moments, disturbing/gory-like images, suspenseful music, and then psychological tension. When combined, these elements can make for some of the most scary moments in film history, and this can be seen through a wide variety of different films. A really good example of this is the movie Hereditary by Ari Aster. What he does is he blends the usage of suspenseful moments and jump scares to make for a scary, scary scene at the movie's climax. In this scene, the character Peter is laying in bed where he's awoken to some noise. So he gets up and he tries to figure out what it is, but he doesn't see anything. But we're able to see that his possessed mother, who's trying to kill him, is actually in the roof of his room, just kind of crawling around. And we can see this, but he can't, making the suspense build for us. So we see him then walk around the house looking for what he thought he heard, trying to find it, and just super scared for him. And we know what the impending doom is and that it's coming. And then eventually the jump scare happens, terrifying him and even terrifying us, even though that we knew what was coming. Now, that type of fear is very calculated. It's very strategic. But there's other types of movies, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacres and the Saws of the world, that just evoke fear out of their viewers with disturbing images. It might be a gory death or a vicious attack, but what they do is they just have the scary stuff stare the viewer right in the face, petrifying them. The usage of suspenseful music is another thing that filmmakers use to try to scare their viewers. Now, a movie that does this really well is The Shining, as pretty much throughout the entire duration of the film, there's just this suspenseful music in the background that progressively gets more and more intense, making the viewer nervous that something is looming in the background and something's eventually going to happen. Even though in The Shining, it's not often the case, you're always worried of it, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. Lastly, there's a psychological aspect of horror films that can really get their viewers nervous. A great example of this is Jordan Peele's Get Out, and the fear in this film derives from a racist family that truly believe that they should be able to enslave black people, and because of this cognitive dissonance that they had, they make unpredictable and terrifying decisions that we just can't understand. Aside from the obvious characteristic of just being scary, horror films also have a bunch of other elements that really make them stand out from other genres. A key characteristic of this is the presence of supernatural beings like ghosts, demons, and vampires, as these beings have a natural fear factor to them, which is difficult for humans to comprehend and thus makes us cautious of them and scared of them. Also, the dark and isolated settings that we often see in horror films is a common theme of them. In The Shining, there's the Overlook Hotel, which is kind of the hub of all the craziness that goes on there. In the show Stranger Things, there's the Upside Down, and that's where all the monsters come from. And there's just kind of these places that set the mood of the horror films and act as platforms for the danger that ensues. And then lastly, another element of horror films is that a lot of them have deep connections between the main character of the film and the dangers that they're facing. Oftentimes, this further involves them in the story and better engages the viewer, and overall just makes for a better frighten at the end of the movie. Now, I just said I was going to touch on the evolution of the horror film, so I do want to talk about that for a little bit. Following the origin stuff that I was telling you earlier about the first horror films, in the 1930s and 40s, we had our first kind of horror boom in Hollywood, where there was just a boom in classic monsters and high drama literacy adaptations of old films like Dracula and Frankenstein. And then from there in the 50s, there became more of a focus on sci-fi horror and Cold War paranoia. Movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Thing from Another World, Godzilla, those really took over. In the 60s, psychological horrors became really big. So movies like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby and The Haunting were absolutely huge. In the 70s, we moved more towards the grit, gore, and rise of modern horror. Now, these are movies like The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Halloween. And with these, you saw more graphic violence and demonic possession and things like that. Just things that visually really screamed horror. And then the 80s, which is often kind of viewed as the golden age of horror movies, where we got movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Hellraiser and The Shining. And these were like a combination of everything we saw before, where we now have some really deep sci-fi elements, but also strong connections between the characters and the things they're interacting with. And it was just really, really good horror movies. And in the 90s, back to psychological thrillers and slashers, the development of those. We got movies like Scream and The Silence of the Lambs. Then in the 2000s, we have torture horror was a big thing, like Saw and The Ring. And then in the 2000s, we kind of had movies that were really focused on social commentary, deeper central themes that have real life significance, kind of like Get Out, and movies like Hereditary and Midsommar that sometimes talk about like trauma and cults. And then with modern horror, we kind of have a hybrid and blending of everything that we saw before. So we had movies like Smile, where mental illness met supernatural horror, and movies like Barbarian, which twists horror structure and kind of the most subversion of the genre that we had ever seen before, but it makes for better horror and more intriguing storylines. To conclude, horror is just a really, really cool genre. The horror films have just an ability to do a wide variety of different things. You have your movies like Get Out that can teach people important lessons about things like racism. You have your absolute thrillers like The Shining and just other movies that are extremely entertaining, and they're just fun and scary, and horror movies are awesome. So you should definitely start watching them.